Ben Goertzel here. I've decided to kick off today what I think is going to be a series of brief videos discussing books that I've read and that have, influenced me or impressed me in some way, and books that want to bring to the attention of others. I'm going to start off today talking about the very interesting book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. Now, Tyson was introduced to me by our mutual friend Jim Rutt. Jim interviewed Tyson for the Jim Rutt Show podcast, so I'd encourage you to take a listen to that. You know, Jim and I have known each other a long time. We have a shared interest in AGI, complex systems, blockchain, the revolutionizing of our currently screwed up human society, and a whole bunch of other things. And many of these are interests that Tyson shares as well. When Jim interviewed Tyson, he said, "Well, Ben, this is one interview you've got to share, you've got to listen to, and please read the guy's book. You'll be doing yourself a favor." And indeed, it's a more stimulating read than I've had for a while, and I've passed it along to a bunch of my friends and relatives and so forth. So Tyson is an academic based in Melbourne, Australia. He also comes from a Indigenous background, so Australian Aboriginal background, and he's in a quite interesting position of sort of spanning those two worlds, like living partly in the world of the modern intellectual technological culture, but yet with one foot in the indigenous world, with the Aboriginal elders and wood carving and various sorts of rituals and sacred spaces and so forth. So I've read a lot of anthropology. I've had a big interest in Stone Age cultures, just because it's fascinating, the very different ways of living and ways of experiencing and being conscious that these cultures have had. And it's fascinating to look at what we've lost as we move from Stone Age culture to modern civilized culture. I mean, as well as the obvious things that we've gained. But most of what I've read about Stone Age cultures before has been, it's written by white people who were living with and learning the language of and studying some Stone Age culture. So Tyson is a little bit different than that. I mean, he's actually have an indigenous background, and he's spanning between the two different worlds. And I think from that view, he has a lot of insights into not just what the indigenous mindset and culture and understanding of the universe is like, but also fairly unique ability to look at our modern society from the indigenous point of view. I mean, one of the things you see when you study the anthropology of Stone Age cultures generally is, in many ways, the folks in these cultures may have been happier and more satisfied than we are in our modern society. I mean, of course, we have antibiotics, and we have the internet and AI systems and airplanes and eyeglasses, and lots of amazing stuff. On the other hand, in many Stone Age situations, I mean, really hard, intensive work was like 2 to 4 hours a day, and much of the time was spent engaging in a sort of mix of social, artistic, and aesthetic, spiritual interactions together with your friends. So I mean, if you're carving something in a hunting boomerang, I mean, this is work, it's art, it's something you may be doing with your family and friends. And on the whole, the life in Stone Age cultures may well have been more personally fulfilling in a more thoroughgoing way than most people's lives are in modern society. And Tyson certainly holds this view. I mean, the view that we've lost some of our basic humanity on a day by day, moment by moment basis in the shift into modern civilized society. Now, this is not certainly a novel idea. I mean, I first encountered this sort of idea personally in Sigmund Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, where Freud looks at the neuroses, the anxieties, the depressions, the various, psychological issues that plague so many people in modern society. And he says, well, these exist mostly because we're repressing our natural behaviors in ways that didn't really happen in Stone Age societies, but happen now because of the need for each of us to act as sort of a cog in the giant machine of modern society. And, when I thought about more deeply in terms of evolutionary psychology, as I wrote about in a blog post some years ago, I posted called The Bullshit at the Heart of Humanity. I mean, I looked at there as being two sort of key factors that make humanity as screwed up as we often are. I mean, one of them is pure evolutionary. Like we have a mix of genomic patterns that evolved for the good of the individual, and we have a mix of genomic patterns that evolved for the good of the group of individuals. So individual selection and group selection. And so each of our motivational systems have some individual selection-based things and some group selection-based things. We sort of can't decide whether we're out for ourselves or for our group. Sometimes it's both in a beautiful harmony. Sometimes there's a conflict between the two and we're tormented. So we already had this conflict of individual versus group selection encoded into our minds and bodies. And then layering onto that, the shift from Stone Age to civilized society and the repression that comes from not even being able to resolve our individual versus group contradictions in the more natural way we evolve for, like they do in Stone Age societies. I mean, we're layering on Freudian repression onto the conflict of individual versus group selection, and we wind up with some crazed mix of conflict and contradiction in our minds, right? And some people are able to overcome these and move to a state of fundamental well-being in the midst of all the mess of modern civilization. But one point that Tyson is making is that, by and large, most people in modern society may be less happy and less fulfilled than in these earlier Stone Age societies, and we don't normally think about that. We think things are getting better and better because we can do more and more stuff in the physical and technological domain, and we're not looking that much at in what dimensions are things improving versus not improving in terms of experience and the heart and body and soul as and the various dimensions of the mind. We're focused more on the realm of physical technology, which is really only one aspect of life. And one thing that often occurs to me in this context is happiness and fulfillment, which are nebulous, difficult things to define, but in a sense, these may be only some among the many top-level goals that drive humanity, right? So, I mean, we are after personal happiness and we're after the good of our social group, but we have an innate love of building things, and we love discovering new things and pioneering new domains. We also have a love for disrupting the old things and breaking on through to the other side. And maybe all these are sort of top level goals in our motivational system. And in terms of some of these goals, modern society is going to be perhaps way more fulfilling than a steady state society like the Australian Indigenous Society, which was in many ways about the same for 60,000 years. So we're excelling in some ways, and we may be going backwards in other ways as we've moved from Stone Age toward modern society. And one of the interesting aspects that Tyson points out in his book is he outlines different varieties of thinking and experiencing individually and collectively that are, prominent in the indigenous worldview. And then he points out that some of these ways of thinking and experiencing sort of get short shrift and have even gone backwards in the transition to modern civilized society. So we could look at kinship mind, that he points out and illustrates by a sort of diagram which has some hidden as well as surface level meanings in it, which you could draw or carve in a piece of wood. Kinship mind, a way of thinking which highlights relationships and connectedness. And then in the indigenous view, the thinking about relationships and connectedness, it's tied in with kinship patterns, men versus women, children, ancestors, the tribal group, and so forth. I mean, there's different fundamental ways of guiding the mind and being in terms of connected relationships among different minds, which are different and in some ways very attenuated in modern society, modern ways of thinking. We have what he calls story mind, narrative, and of course, narrative passed along orally in rituals and just one-to-one communications or small group communications are quite different than narratives transmitted through books. I mean, including excellent books like this one, because there's an individuality and a contextualization that happens when you're getting across narratives sort of in an I-thou, human to human direct transmission rather than through something recorded in a more context-free way in an artifact like this. We have story mind, we have dreaming mind, which we can touch that in our own ways through psychedelics and meditation and various what we call altered states of consciousness. But the dreaming mind played a more critical role in most indigenous societies, and arguably, in the indigenous society, they're able to get much deeper into some aspects of the dreaming mind than we do in modern culture. Ancestor mind, what he talks about there is a bit like a flow state, but I don't normally think of a flow state as a matter of like connecting with my great grandparents and so forth. And so it's a different spin on or a species of flow state or something a little different, but related to what we think of the flow state we get into when we're like intensively jamming on music or writing something or carving something or whatever. And then what he calls pattern mind, which in some ways maybe the most familiar to those of us who are neck deep in modern civilized society, just seeing trends and patterns and predicting and extrapolating. So all of these aspects of cognition and understanding exist now in modern civilized society, in our modern way of thinking. Like, it's not like we've completely lost any of them, but clearly the balance has way shifted from what it was in indigenous societies. And what Tyson Yunkaporta argues is that this is a major loss. Like, we're now huddled off in one little corner of humanity space, obsessing on pattern recognition and building technology and turning ourselves into a kind of machine and giving short shrift to the connectedness and kinship patterns and connection with our ancestors and our children and great grandchildren, and with the dream time broader mind space. Like, we're neglecting all that, and we're focusing on one little corner of human experience and human capability. And that's why our society is so imbalanced and unhealthy, why we're destroying the physical environment around us so badly, and why there's so much neurosis, depression, and general unhappiness in modern society. And it's a fairly powerful argument. I mean, it's one that I have mixed feelings about, to be honest, because I can see there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot that was lost and in the transition to civilization, and I can see that in some ways, even the states of extraordinary well-being that one can get into now through meditation and various other practices, in some ways they're still lacking certain dimensions that were there in the states of extraordinary well-being that were more commonplace in indigenous society and still are in indigenous societies in some places where they're persisting. On the other hand, being a singularitarian and very interested in new worlds and new ways of being and creating new kinds of minds, like AGI systems, cyborgs, mind uploads, and whatnot, I can't help but thinking personally, and this is not at all what Tyson is saying in his book, but I can't help but thinking personally that a lot of what's lost is going to be regained and then some, right? Like I can't help thinking that, you know, the dreaming mind and the up close and personal transmission of narratives and the connectivity with your kin and your ancestors and so forth. I mean, all this may come back with a flourish once we create an economy of abundance, and once we, you know, cure sickness and death, and once we're able to connect our minds with other minds through neural Wi-Fi and hybridize our minds with AGIs of various sorts. It seems like, you know, a lot of capabilities will be there which aren't there now, and which are very different than what indigenous folks experienced. But, you know, of course, we'll be missing some dimensions that were there in indigenous societies, but maybe adding a whole lot of other amazing dimensions that neither modern civilized humans nor indigenous humans had, right? So think about it, you know, if you can do neural Wi-Fi, you know, what new kinds of kinship patterns are there? If you have full introspection into all your previous versions and records of how everyone influenced you in the past, you know, what sort of spiritual ancestor connection is there in that? And, you know, if you can create multiple copies of yourself and let them explore different regions of consciousness space, if you can explore not only a profound connection with one body in one place, but with multiple bodies in multiple places, I mean, what sorts of incredible dreaming as well as reasoning experiences could you have? I mean, most talk about the technological singularity focuses on material aspects, like we can crunch numbers faster, we can solve problems faster, we can, you know, 3D print nano and femto stuff better and better with more and more flexibility. But there's also incredible potential for expanding the states of consciousness that we're open to as we move toward singularity. Now, what Tyson said when I talked to him about this, I mean, I don't want to try to paraphrase his point of view because there are many aspects of it I obviously can't fully understand yet. I'm trying to dig deeper and deeper. But one point that he made is that in the indigenous perspective, you know, mind is really tied through, you know, the haptic experience and other senses to a specific place. And from an indigenous view, something like mind uploading that rips a mind away from a specific body and place is just very counterintuitive and potentially, you know, not a good or even meaningful thing. And then a mind like an AGI that isn't tied to any place or any body, but it's just a pattern of bits or qubits that can be poured around anywhere. I mean, that's not something that in the indigenous worldview seems tremendously natural or meaningful or conducive to profound, you know, personal and spiritual satisfaction. Now, I mean, there's a lot of depth and flexibility in the indigenous view. I don't want to try to oversimplify it, but clearly their view, the indigenous perspective has an aspect that thinks, well, we're losing something by our lack of rootedness in the land already, and we'd be losing that a lot more if we like mind upload it into hard drives somewhere, right? And this is quite thought-provoking. I mean, I started thinking, okay, if you have one guy here whose mind is very grounded in his body and in the land he grew up on and lives on and knows almost as well as his body, you have another guy here who's, you know, extremely abstract in his point of view and views his mind as sort of a, you know, a virtual machine running on his body, which is pretty much independent of any physical location on the planet or any planet or even this physical universe. His mind is just a pattern of organization. You know, as this guy with a more grounded perspective opens up to sort of dreamtime states of consciousness, you know, does he actually have access to different modes of dreamtime expanded consciousness than this guy who has a less grounded experience in his everyday mind. I mean, when modern humans explore psychedelic or meditative experiences, they often sort of get lost in a rootless and confused way. And could this be because they don't have the same pattern of groundedness that indigenous people have when they explore these dreamtime related spaces? So I mean, I think there's a lot of subtlety here, but yet there's also a lot of unknowns and amazing new horizons. Like the sort of groundedness you can have in the land you grew up on. Could a mind have that groundedness in some region of a knowledge hypergraph, let's say? I mean, the pattern of grounding your individual mind in a complex external domain with a certain structure that may be highly valuable for grounding you as you explore broader consciousness domains, but perhaps there are many ways of achieving that sort of grounding besides grounding in a single physical body and a single physical location, right? So I mean, there's a lot to think about here in terms of what was gained when we went from Stone Age society to civilized society, what was lost, and then what could be regained, perhaps in a transformed but also highly interesting and fulfilling form as we move on from civilized society to post-singularity society. So anyway, I've shared a little bit of what Tyson talks about in his amazing book here, and shared a whole bunch of my own wacky singularitarian speculations triggered by the book. And I'd encourage you to dig in and find out what Tyson has to say for yourself. I mean, there's a lot of other dimensions beyond what I touched on here. And one other aspect that intrigued me is sort of, you know, by the way, in passing, while discussing other aspects, there's a bunch of aspects of indigenous society that he mentions that you know we would associate with paranormal or psi phenomena. And this is something that interests me a lot. Also, you can look at the book The Evidence for Psi that I co-edited with Damien Broderick a few years ago. I mean, I think that while there's a lot of fraud and delusion in the area, I also think there's some reality to things like ESP, precognition, remote viewing, and so forth, which our modern society doesn't yet grapple with well, though I think it will, and which in the indigenous world is just taken for granted that this stuff is part of life. And again, this is something else that I wonder, well, the real bottom line of these paranormal phenomena, you know, is that going to become extremely clear to us once we have post-singularity minds that you know have sensors inside everybody's brain, and as well at the quantum level? And are we going to see some of the synchronicities between, you know, the paranormal and the everyday experience, or that indigenous peoples already understood in their own way, going beyond how we understand these things in modern civilization? Are we going to see these things in a yet deeper way once we have the post-singularity understanding? But anyway, I've gone on more than long enough. You know, read Tyson's book, listen to his interview with Jim Rutt on Jim Rutt Show podcast, and give it a think for yourself. Your reactions and improvisations will probably differ from mine and Tyson's, but that's how it should be.